Let's go through some keys to good minimalist sports design. The first thing, and what's gonna do most of the heavy lifting in the design, is just the selection of your player image. So a few things to keep in mind with this: it could be a player in some kind of cool action pose, maybe a player showing a lot of emotion, or if you have a player like jumping over someone or involving other players, that can also kind of help fill the space and keep things interesting in a minimalist design. So for this example, we're gonna drag in this Matt Smith cutout. He's jumping up for the disc. He's in a cool pose. We're gonna size this somewhere around there, and we can adjust the sizing to be more precise later. But once you have your cutout, let's think about the background. So in a minimalist design, you want the background to be, as clean, as plain as possible. Maybe you have a subtle gradient, but also a solid color should work fine. So we don't really want to use pure white ever. I think it's just a little too extreme. So let's go to our effects and go to gradient overlay. Let's make this kind of blended gray gradient background. And we can have this going from, a slightly off-white to a darker gray on the outsides. Kind of gives this vignetting effect over the whole thing. Now for the other elements, we don't really want them to take away from the main focus of the image, which is just our central cutout, but we want them to complement it. So let's keep things small. I just want to put his name and team name at the top, and we'll just do a single logo at the bottom of the design. So let's drag in that logo first. This is the Atlanta Hustle logo. And I'm gonna keep this pretty small. Don't be afraid to shrink your elements down pretty small, again, to keep the player as the featured part of the minimalist design. And for positioning, let's go to our guides and a new guide layout. We're gonna do 1.5 for the margins. These are a little bigger than I normally have them, but again, just when it comes to white space and knowing that the design has so much space to work with, you can kind of pinch in the margins to, again, keep the focus more towards the center. So let's go with 1.5. That is this second blue line here. And we'll center the logo. And now let's type out some text for the top. So going to my type tool, let's type out Matt Smith. There's this cool double arrow text character that you can get by Option, Shift, and then backslash. And I like that for this. We'll go Atlanta Hustle. And we'll shrink this down to not 8, let's do 18. So again, pretty small text, but still readable. It's not too pixely, so I think it's fine. And we can maybe move the cutout down a bit. So this is kind of the base of our design. Main cutout, text at the top, logo at the bottom. Real simple. Now the way to make this design more interesting isn't adding more elements in the background or overlays over the top. We're just gonna really key in on our player cutout and make it as detailed as possible, basically. So let's start with camera raw filter, going up to filter, camera raw filter, and we'll start with some basic adjustments like exposure, maybe bring up the contrast. I kind of like the highlights a little bit brighter on a mostly white background. Can bring up the shadows too. So we're just kind of brightening him up a bit and increasing some contrast. And then texture and clarity, always a good idea to add some more pop. And with this image, I think it was taken at night, so you can see it looks a little bit grainy. I'm gonna up the noise reduction a good bit to 40, and it kind of just smooths out everything, which is kind of a fun effect for this. So you'll see after camera raw filter, before it looked like this, after a lot more shiny and smooth. We're gonna kind of keep going in that shiny smooth direction for this example. So to do that, I'm going to first drop in a curves layer and clip it to our main cutout layer just by holding Option, hovering in the space and clicking. This one we're gonna set to luminosity. You can watch my video on advanced lighting. That's the technique we're gonna use right now. But basically bringing up these curves to kind of brighten the whole thing and then putting a mask on it, an inverted mask. So let's hold Option and click our mask icon. And then hitting B for our brush tool, we're just gonna brush in where the brighter parts of the image are, and let's lower our flow a good bit. So we're just kind of creating some contrast between the bright parts and the dark parts of the cutouts. Like you can see his arm is brightened up there, outside of his arm, his hand maybe a little bit, face we can probably brighten up. And I'm just gonna go through this sort of quickly, but again, watch that video if you need a slower, more focused breakdown of this process. That feels good for the highlights. Let's duplicate this and delete this layer mask, reset it with another black mask, and this one we're just gonna bring down. Actually, let's hide that for now so we can bring down the curves, and now let's bring this back on. So now we're gonna brush on in dark all the dark parts on our player cutout. And typically I don't like to darken the face too much because I want that to really pop the most. And it's funny because you can't really tell while you're doing it too much what you're affecting, but it is really clear in the end when we'll show the before and after what this is doing. Moment you've been waiting for, before and after of all that. Before and after, you could just, it kind of gives like a glossy finish to the whole cutout, which is cool, makes it sort of pop off the page a little bit more, which we like. So now let's get a shadow below him. So I'm gonna make a new layer and just make a black soft dot. We want the flow to be 100. And then Command T to transform. I'm just gonna size this, spread it out a little bit. And so we'll get something like this. And then I'm gonna bring this opacity a good bit down because he is a good bit off the ground. So maybe something around 20%. And because this knee is slightly closer to the ground than the rest of him, I do want to duplicate this layer, and we'll just make a smaller version of this and move it over to line up with his knee. Just a subtle way to make it a little bit more realistic. And if it's feeling like too much, you can always group these shadows into a folder and then lower the opacity of the whole thing. So up to you. Maybe we want to spread this up a little bit to get a bit more of it. And right now I'm feeling like the whole cutout, so I'm grouping the whole cutout with the shadows in a folder. Feeling like it's a little bit too low right now. We want it balanced kind of between the top and the bottom element that we have in place. So let's move this whole thing up. The next thing we'll do is look at the colors on the cutout. So you can see clearly, even though the Hustle is a purple and black team, this jersey is looking super blue, and more importantly, it's just looking very different than the purple text we have at the top or the purple in the logo. So let's fix that. Let's be very consistent with our colors. Let's go into our cutout and add a layer for selective color. This again should be clipped to just affecting our cutout. Let's make like a reference box next to it. So making a new layer with the Atlanta Hustle purple. And this is what we're gonna compare the jersey color to. So now in our selective color layer, let's mess with these settings in the blues. And yeah, adding magenta definitely helps. Lowering the cyan. Yeah, that's feeling a lot better. Okay, and then also the skin tones. I feel like naturally when you take pictures at night, they tend to be a little bit more yellow than they need to be. So I'm gonna reduce the yellows in the red color of the selective color, because the reds are the skin tones. And maybe we up the magenta a little bit. Yeah, something like this. And I kind of want to brighten them up too, because again, we just have a brighter theme for this graphic because we're on this white and gray background. So something like this. And I'm going to delete this reference block. Now we can see what that selective color did before the selective color, after. Obviously that purple makes a big difference in just making it feel like it fits in with the image a bit better. It's seeming a little bit dark to me, so I'm going to go back in to the blues and just lighten the black value, and it'll give us a little bit more detail in the jersey as well. So let's take off all of our cutout effects, see where we started. No shadows, no camera raw filter, none of the shading. This is what we started with, and then adding in that coloring and shading, adding the shadow. This helps a ton in camera raw filter, of course. So you can see the difference that these effects make, and they just become all the more important when really the cutout is the only focus of a minimalist design. So if you just cut out a photo and threw in a cutout and built these simple elements around it, it would look okay, but clearly it will look a lot better if you put in the time and effort to like enhance your player cutout, add that detail, really take your time. We could leave it as is. I would say throw some basic texture over the top. We're just gonna do a layer of grain. So let's make a new layer, Command A to select the whole screen, and then hitting W for my quick selection tool. Let's right click and go to fill, 50% gray. And then we'll go up to filter, convert for smart filters, and then filter noise, add noise. And we want something like pretty subtle, maybe like 7%. And then we'll set this blend mode to hard light and lower the opacity to, I don't know, 50%. Should be good. Again, you don't need a lot of textures and overlays with a minimalist design. You don't want things that are taking the attention away from your main subject. So keeping things plain and simple is really the key. If you want, you can always mess with the colors afterwards too. So if we wanted to add a color lookup of any kind, or if you want to mess with selective color, gradient maps, you can always do that. You can see what some of these look like. I kind of like this 3-strip look. Kind of brings out the skin tones a bit more, but we can lower this opacity down to, I don't know, 45. So to lay out the main keys, 1, cutout selection, super important. 2, cutout detail, adding that sharpening, adding camera raw, really taking the time to enhance the highlights and decrease the shadows on your cutout. Clean background is absolutely key. It doesn't have to be white. You could do the team color, you could do black, but generally a solid color or a really soft gradient is great. Complementary elements, keep them small, out of the way, keep that focus on the center. And then very limited with your textures and colors and other things that can take away from the main focus of the design.